1981, Cadillac put a computer in charge of its most important engine. The computer could process 300,000 operations per second. Sounds impressive. It wasn't nearly enough. Within months, dealers across America were quietly disconnecting the system and pretending it never existed. This is the story of the Cadillac V8-6-4, the engine that was supposed to save the most prestigious name in American luxury. Instead, it nearly buried it. To understand how Cadillac ended up here, you have to go back a bit. Through the 1950s, 60s, and most of the 70s, Cadillac was untouchable, the standard of the world. That wasn't just a slogan, it was basically a fact. Cadillac owned close to a third of the American luxury car market. Their engines were legendary, the 472, the 500, massive, silky, smooth V8s that made driving feel effortless. A Cadillac in the driveway meant you'd made it. Doctors drove them, lawyers drove them, presidents rode in them. The brand had built a 70-year reputation on one simple promise: get in one and nothing else feels good enough. Then the world changed. 2 oil crises in 6 years turned the American car market upside down. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo sent gas prices through the roof and left drivers sitting in lines that stretched for blocks. Then, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution did it all over again. The Shah fled Iran in January. By the time the dust settled, Iranian oil production had crashed from 6 million barrels a day to about 1.5 million. Americans were rationing gas with odd-even license plate systems. Fistfights broke out at filling stations. The price of crude oil increased 250% between 1978 and 1980. Washington responded the way Washington does, with regulations. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975 created something called Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, CAFE for short. The rules were simple in concept and brutal in execution. Every automaker had to hit a fleet-wide average fuel economy target across all the cars they sold. Started at 18 miles per gallon in 1978, 19 the next year, 20 the year after that. Had to reach 27.5 by 1985. Missed the target and you paid civil penalties on every single car you sold. The penalties weren't crippling on a per-car basis, but multiplied across hundreds of thousands of vehicles. They added up fast. Then, in 1978, the Energy Tax Act piled on the gas guzzler tax. This one was different. It hit individual models, not fleet averages. Any passenger car that fell below a certain mileage threshold got slapped with an extra tax at the point of sale, passed on to the buyer. $200 per car in 1980 for anything rated between 14 and 15 miles per gallon. $550 for anything below 13, and those numbers were scheduled to climb steeply. By 1985, the tax on the worst offenders would hit $1,800. By 86, nearly $4,000. The government wasn't asking nicely anymore. Now, if you were Toyota or Honda, CAFE was fine. You already built small, efficient cars. This was your entire business model. If you were Cadillac, this was an existential crisis. Cadillac's entire identity, its reason for existing, was built on big engines in big cars. Their flagship V8 had been 500 cubic inches just a decade earlier, 8.2 liters. It made 400 horsepower and could tow a house. It also got about 9 miles per gallon on a good day, which was roughly the fuel economy of a small aircraft carrier. Even by 1980, after they'd shrunk the engine to 425 cubic inches, the numbers were still nowhere near what the government wanted. The entire American passenger car fleet averaged about 13 miles per gallon in 1974. By 1981, the CAFE mandate was pushing the industry average past 28. Cadillac was dragging the whole curve down. Cadillac couldn't just slap a 4-cylinder in a DeVille and call it a day. Their customers were wealthy, loyal, and deeply particular about what a Cadillac was supposed to feel like. These were people who traded in their Cadillacs every 2 or 3 years like clockwork. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, retirees who'd spent 40 years earning the right to own one. The average Cadillac buyer was well over 60 years old. They didn't want innovation. They wanted the same experience they'd always had. Quiet, smooth, powerful enough that you never had to think about power. If you told a 1979 Fleetwood owner that his next Cadillac would have a 4-cylinder engine, he'd walk straight into a Mercedes dealership, and some of them were already doing that. Meanwhile, the Japanese were circling. Toyota and Honda were flooding the market with small, efficient, well-built cars that made Detroit's offerings look sloppy. The total American passenger car market had peaked at nearly 11 million vehicles in 1978 and was in free fall, eventually dropping below 8 million by 1982. Younger, older, wealthier buyers on the coasts were already eyeing European luxury cars. The brand was under siege from every direction, so Cadillac had a problem with no obvious solution. They needed the fuel economy numbers to satisfy the federal government. They needed the power and refinement to satisfy their customers. And they needed it fast because the CAFE targets were tightening every single year. For 1981, GM needed a sales-weighted fleet average of at least 22 miles per gallon. Cadillac, selling roughly 1 out of every 17 GM cars, was dragging that number down hard. Their first attempt was pathetic. They borrowed the Oldsmobile 350 diesel V8 and stuffed it in the Seville as the standard engine. On paper, the mileage numbers looked great. In practice, the engine was a catastrophe of blown head gaskets and seized internals that would eventually turn an entire generation of American buyers against diesel passenger cars for 2 decades. But that's a different story. For the gasoline models, Cadillac had already downsized their big block from 425 cubic inches to 368 for 1980, 6 liters. The L61, as GM coded it, was a deboard version of the engine family that dated back to 1968. It made 145 horsepower with fuel injection. Adequate, not embarrassing. But the mileage numbers were still not good enough to keep Cadillac out of gas guzzler tax territory, and they definitely weren't helping GM's overall CAFE average. Cadillac needed a miracle. What they got instead was an idea that was about 20 years ahead of its time and a computer that was about 20 years behind the requirements. The concept itself was elegant. What if, instead of running all 8 cylinders all the time, you could shut some of them off when you didn't need them? Cruising down the highway at 60 miles per hour doesn't require the same power as merging onto the interstate. So you'd run on 8 cylinders when you needed the power, drop to 6 for moderate driving, and coast along on 4 when you were just cruising. 3 engines in 1. That's literally how Cadillac marketed it. The idea wasn't new. Engineers had experimented with cylinder deactivation on multi-cylinder engines as far back as World War II, but nobody had ever tried to do it in a mass-production passenger car with electronic controls. Cadillac and the Eaton Corporation, a major automotive supplier, decided they'd be the first. Eaton held a series of patents from 1975 on the valve deactivation hardware, and together they developed what GM officially called modulated displacement. The mechanical side was fairly straightforward. On cylinders 3, 4, 5, and 6, they installed solenoids on the rocker arm studs. When the system wanted to deactivate a cylinder, the solenoid would disengage the fulcrum, letting the rocker arm float free. The push rods kept moving, but the valves stayed shut. No air-fuel mixture going in, no exhaust going out. The trapped air inside the cylinder acted as a spring, which was supposed to keep things smooth and keep the cylinder warm for instant reactivation. The brain of the operation was the computer command module, the CCM. It monitored everything: engine speed, road speed, throttle position, manifold pressure, coolant temperature. Based on all those inputs, it decided how many cylinders should be running at any given moment and activated or deactivated them in pairs. Cadillac's advertising proudly announced that this computer could process 300,000 operations per second. They put the whole system on the L62, the fuel-injected version of the 368 V8. It made 140 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque. Not a lot by historical Cadillac standards, but the torque hit at just 1,400 RPM, which meant the car still felt appropriately effortless in normal driving. They gave it throttle body fuel injection, a dashboard display called the MPG Sentinel that showed how many cylinders were active and your instantaneous fuel economy, and they made it standard equipment on every single gasoline-powered Cadillac for 1981. The DeVille, the Fleetwood, the Eldorado, all of them. The only exception was the Seville, which came standard with that disaster of a diesel and offered the V8-6-4 as a credit option. Cadillac was all in, every chip on the table, no hedging, no optional carbureted V8 as a fallback for nervous customers. If you bought a gasoline-powered Cadillac in 1981, you got the V8-6-4, period. The advertising was confident to the point of hubris. Cadillac called it a prime example of American innovation in action, like 3 engines in 1. The brochures were gorgeous. The engineering diagrams were impressive. The promise was simple. You'd get Cadillac power when you needed it and Cadillac economy when you didn't. What could possibly go wrong? The press cars worked fine. That's the thing. Credulous journalists testing carefully prepared vehicles on GM's proving grounds wrote glowing reviews. The transitions between cylinder counts were smooth. The fuel economy was improved. Jim Dunn at Popular Science rode along on the test track and came away impressed. The future of the American automobile had arrived, he basically said. And on a smooth oval track with a professional driver feathering the throttle at a controlled speed, he wasn't entirely wrong. Then the cars got into the hands of actual customers driving on actual roads in actual traffic, and everything fell apart, spectacularly. The problems started almost immediately. The CCM, for all its 300,000 operations per second, simply could not keep up with real-world driving conditions. 300,000 sounds like a lot. It wasn't. The system had to track too many variables simultaneously. Engine load changed constantly. Drivers didn't feather the throttle the way test drivers did on a proving ground. They stabbed it. They lifted. They went up hills and down hills and around corners and through traffic. Every change in condition required the computer to make a decision about cylinder count, and it was perpetually behind. The symptoms were maddening, especially for people who had paid Cadillac money for a Cadillac experience. When the engine shifted from 4 cylinders back to 8, there was a lag, not a subtle one. A noticeable, gut-dropping hesitation where the car just didn't respond. You'd press the gas to merge onto a highway, and for a beat or two, nothing would happen. Then power would arrive, often too aggressively, because the fuel injection system and the deactivation system were essentially fighting each other over what state the engine was supposed to be in. Imagine trying to merge into 60-mile-per-hour traffic in a 4,000-pound Cadillac that's taking a moment to think about whether it wants to be a V8 or a V4. That's not a luxury car experience. That's a near-death experience. The throttle body injection made things worse. Because it had only one injector per cylinder bank rather than individual injectors for each cylinder, there was no way to precisely cut fuel to deactivated cylinders. The system kept sending an air-fuel mixture past closed valves, which meant some cylinders were getting fuel they couldn't burn. Fuel economy suffered. Emissions suffered. The injectors leaked and stuck. The intake manifold iced up. At certain cruising speeds, the system went completely haywire. The computer would hunt between cylinder counts, cycling from 8 to 6 to 4 and back again, never settling on a configuration. The car would surge and stumble and surge again, like an automatic transmission that couldn't find the right gear. Owners quickly learned which speeds to avoid. There's a story about a limousine driver in the 1990s who still had a V8-6-4 Cadillac. Taped to his dashboard was a handwritten note with 2 speeds on it, something like 45 and 68 miles per hour. Those were the speeds where the hunting was worst, and he'd learned to just never drive at those speeds. A decade later, and the man was still navigating around the ghosts of a flawed computer. The EGR system added another layer of misery. The engineers had chosen a positive back pressure EGR valve, which worked fine in a normal engine, but was a disaster in one that kept changing how many cylinders were producing exhaust. On 4 cylinders, there wasn't enough exhaust back pressure to operate the EGR correctly, which caused pinging. On 8, there was too much. The system was chasing its own tail. And then there were the truly dangerous failures. One owner in Kentucky reported driving 80 miles per hour on the interstate when the engine dropped from 8 to 4 cylinders and simply died. The whole engine gone at highway speed. Now think about what that means in a 1981 Cadillac. No engine means no power steering. The steering effort in those cars without power assist was enormous. No engine also means no power brakes. A 63-year-old man with 2 feet on the brake pedal, arms locked on the steering wheel, going 80 on the highway in a 2-ton Cadillac with no way to meaningfully slow down or steer. He said his life flashed before his eyes. He survived. Barely. No other cars were nearby. He managed to coast to a stop, get it into park, restart the engine. Then he went to the owner's manual, found the fuse that disabled the solenoids, pulled it, and got rid of the car the next day. He wasn't the only one. Cadillac dealerships across the country were flooded. The service bays were full. The complaints kept coming, and the people complaining weren't the type to shrug it off. These were Cadillac buyers. They expected perfection, and what they got was a car that couldn't decide how many cylinders it wanted to use. Cadillac's response was, by the standards of early 80s Detroit, actually pretty fast. They issued 13 PROM chip updates during 1981 alone. 13. That's more than one per month, each one an attempt to reprogram the CCM to handle real-world conditions better. Some helped, none fixed it. The fundamental problem wasn't software, it was hardware. The processor simply did not have the computational power to manage this many variables in real time. No amount of code optimization could overcome that. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do deep dives like this every week. All right, back to it. So let's talk about what was actually happening inside this engine from a technical perspective, because the mechanical engineering was genuinely clever even if the electronics betrayed it. The base engine, the 368 cubic inch V8, was the last descendant of a bloodline that stretched back to Cadillac's 472 of 1968. It had been progressively shrunk from 500 cubic inches down to 425 and finally debored to 368 with a bore of 3.80 inches. Below the cylinder heads, it was essentially the same proven cast iron push rod of V8 that had powered hundreds of thousands of Cadillacs without complaint. Stout bottom end, hydraulic lifters, 3-speed turbo hydromatic transmission, nothing exotic. The exotic stuff was all above the deck. The cylinder heads on the L62 were completely redesigned from the standard 368. Cylinders 3, 4, 5, and 6 got the solenoid treatment, with the deactivation hardware adding height to the rocker covers, making them look distinctly different from any other Cadillac engine. You could spot a V8-6-4 from across a parking lot just by the tall, bumpy valve covers with electrical connectors poking out of the top. Here's how deactivation worked, step by step. Under normal operation, the push rods pushed the rocker arms, which opened the intake and exhaust valves. Standard stuff. When the CCM decided a cylinder should be deactivated, it energized the solenoid for that cylinder pair. The solenoid disengaged the fulcrum that the rocker arm pivoted on, essentially pulling the floor out from under it. The rocker arm would float freely, and even though the push rod kept moving up and down, it couldn't transmit that motion to the valve. Both intake and exhaust valves stayed closed. With the valves sealed, the air already trapped in the cylinder became a pneumatic spring. As the piston moved up, it compressed that air. As it came back down, the air expanded and pushed it back. In theory, this absorbed the energy cleanly, prevented any sensation of missing, and kept the cylinder at operating temperature for instant reactivation. In theory, the fuel injection system was throttle body, meaning a single injector sat above each bank of 4 cylinders and sprayed fuel into the intake manifold, which then distributed it to all 4 cylinders on that side. This was the system's fundamental design flaw. When you deactivated 2 cylinders on one bank, the injector was still spraying fuel for 4. The CCM was supposed to compensate by adjusting the injector pulse width, reducing the total fuel for that bank. But the precision required to get this right, millisecond by millisecond, was beyond the system's capability. Too much fuel, and the active cylinders ran rich. Too little, and they ran lean and pinged. The 300,000 operations per second figure that Cadillac advertised for the CCM was real. But context matters. A modern engine control unit processes millions of operations per second and has exponentially more memory and programming sophistication. The 1981 CCM was essentially asked to juggle 7 chainsaws while riding a unicycle, using a brain the size of a calculator watch. It could technically do each individual task. It could not do all of them simultaneously, quickly enough to produce smooth operation. The system deactivated cylinders in pairs to maintain some semblance of firing order balance. Drop from 8 to 6 meant shutting off 1 pair. Drop to 4 meant shutting off 2 pairs. The pairs were on opposite sides of the engine to preserve balance. On 6 cylinders, the engine displaced about 4.5 liters. On 4, about 3 liters. In the 4-cylinder mode, the engine sounded like a diesel to some owners, which, given that the Seville already came with an actual diesel that was also terrible, must have been deeply ironic. The onboard diagnostics were actually ahead of their time. Through the climate control display and the MPG Sentinel, mechanics could read trouble codes, view real-time real-time sensor data, force-cycle individual solenoids, and even manually control which cylinder pairs were active. This was 1981. Most cars didn't have anything close to this level of electronic diagnostic capability. The system that was supposed to control the engine was inadequate. The system that was supposed to diagnose the problems was surprisingly excellent. Life has a sense of humor like that. The consequences came fast, and they hit hard. Cadillac dealers were overwhelmed with complaints. Customers who had paid $15,000 or more for a new Cadillac, which was serious money in 1981, were furious. These weren't people who expected to debug their luxury car. These were people who expected to turn the key and glide. Cadillac's official solution, after the 13 failed software updates, was to tell dealers to disable the system, just disconnect it. A single wire from the transmission's third gear switch was all it took, or you could wire in a toggle switch for manual override. The engine would then run as a straight V8 all the time, like any other Cadillac V8. It ran fine like that. The 368 was a solid engine when it wasn't being asked to perform electronic gymnastics. GM also sent letters to every V8-6-4 owner offering what they called an engine value protection plan. That was corporate language for an extended warranty covering 5 years or 50,000 miles, transferable to subsequent owners. Class action lawsuits followed. Dealers reportedly refused to take some of these cars in on trade. One owner's story involved trading her '81 Fleetwood after Cadillac agreed to disconnect the system but voided the warranty in doing so. She bought a Chrysler Fifth Avenue, a lifelong Cadillac customer. Gone. Now here's the twist that most people get wrong. The popular version of this story says Cadillac panicked, killed the V8-6-4, and rushed out the HT4100 as a replacement for 1982. That's not what happened. Cadillac had already decided to drop the V8-6-4 before it even went on sale. The HT4100, an all-new aluminum block 4.1-liter V8, had been in development since the mid-70s. Its production was common knowledge in Detroit by early 1979. The V8-6-4 was always intended as a one-year stopgap, a bridge to keep Cadillac out of gas guzzler territory while the new engine's factory tooling was completed. The real irony is that the HT4100 turned out to be even worse. 125 horsepower, 190 pound-feet of torque in a car that weighed over 4,000 pounds, a fully loaded '82 Cadillac with the HT4100 had roughly the power-to-weight ratio of a diesel Chevette. Owners reported being passed by U-Haul trucks on mountain highways, and the reliability was abysmal. Stripped head bolt threads because an aluminum block with iron heads is a recipe for thermal expansion nightmares. Failed oil pumps, blown intake manifold gaskets. By mid-1983, dealer lots were lined with nearly new Cadillacs awaiting warranty engine replacements at a rate the brand had never seen before. And remember, this was happening at the same time the diesel was also failing constantly. The damage to Cadillac's reputation was profound and lasting. The brand that had once owned nearly a third of the American luxury market watched its most loyal customers walk away. And these weren't customers who left quietly. They told their friends. They told their golf partners. They told everyone at the country club that their new Cadillac was a piece of junk and that the dealer couldn't fix it and that Cadillac didn't care. Word of mouth built the Cadillac brand over 70 years. Word of mouth tore it down in two. Many of those customers walked straight into Mercedes and BMW showrooms. 1981 was also the year Mercedes launched its turbo diesel inline 5, the 300D, as an option for American buyers. The Germans were ready. Their cars were smaller, but the build quality was impeccable. The engines actually worked, and the prestige factor was shifting. BMW was pushing its way into the American market with the 3 Series and 5 Series. Suddenly, European luxury wasn't just for eccentrics on the coasts. It was becoming the default choice for successful Americans who no longer trusted Detroit. Those German brands built their American market share on the backs of fleeing Cadillac owners, and they never gave it back. Cadillac sales had topped 300,000 units as recently as 1978. By the mid-'80s, the bleeding was constant, even if the raw numbers held up for a while because of aggressive fleet sales and heavy discounting. The brand's prestige, the thing that actually made people pay a premium for a Cadillac, was gone. Today, Cadillac holds less than 7% of the luxury market. That decline started right here in 1981, with a computer that couldn't count to 8 fast enough. The V8-6-4 limped on in one application. Cadillac kept it in the Fleetwood commercial chassis, the platform used for limousines and hearses, through 1984. Most of those had the system disconnected from the factory. Apparently, even Cadillac decided that a hearse stalling at a funeral was a poor look. So what happened next? Cadillac spent the rest of the 1980s scrambling and failing repeatedly. They borrowed the Oldsmobile 307 V8 for the Brugum from 86 to 89 because they literally had nothing else that worked. They didn't want to do this. An Oldsmobile engine in a Cadillac was an admission of defeat, but it was the only motor available that would fit, run reliably, and not embarrass the brand further, which tells you how bad things had gotten. Then there was the Cimarron. In 1982, the same year the HT4100 was destroying what was left of Cadillac's engineering credibility, someone at GM decided to badge engineer a Chevrolet Cavalier as a Cadillac. Leather seats, a slightly different grille, a Cadillac badge on a $12,000 economy car with a 1.8-liter four-cylinder engine. The Cimarron remains one of the most universally mocked vehicles in automotive history. It was the equivalent of putting a tuxedo on a golden retriever and trying to get it into a five-star restaurant. Everybody knew. Nobody was fooled. Between the V8-6-4, the diesel disaster, the HT4100, and the Cimarron, Cadillac had somehow managed to alienate almost every segment of its customer base in the span of about 3 years. The loyal older buyers who wanted traditional Cadillac power were betrayed by the V8-6-4 and then insulted by the HT4100. The younger buyers Cadillac desperately needed to attract took one look at the Cimarron and went to BMW. It took until 1990 and the return of the 5.7-liter V8 before Cadillac had a truly competent engine in its big cars again. Almost a full decade lost, an entire generation of buyers gone. But the story doesn't end there. And this is the part that makes the V8-6-4 genuinely fascinating rather than just a cautionary tale. Cylinder deactivation works. The concept was right. The execution was just impossibly premature. GM came back to it in 2005, rebranding it as displacement on demand, later renamed active fuel management. This time, with modern processors that could handle millions of calculations per second, hydraulic lifters controlled by oil pressure instead of mechanical solenoids, and sequential port fuel injection that could precisely meter fuel to individual cylinders, the system actually worked. Mostly. The early AFM systems from 2007 to 2013 still had their share of lifter failures and oil consumption issues. GM truck owners today will tell you that disabling AFM is one of the first things they do, and there's an entire aftermarket industry selling plug-in devices that prevent the system from activating. Some things never change, but the technology kept improving. In 2018, GM introduced Dynamic Fuel Management. DFM doesn't just switch between 8 and 4 cylinders. It can deactivate any individual cylinder in any combination across 17 different patterns, making 80 decisions per second. The ECU running that system processes nearly 70,000 lines of code. The 1981 CCM had considerably less. Every cylinder gets its own collapsible hydraulic lifter. Every transition is managed with a precision that the engineers at Eaton in 1975 could barely have imagined. Today, about 15% of all light vehicles sold in America use some form of cylinder deactivation. Honda does it. Chrysler calls theirs multi-displacement system. Mercedes does it. Even some four-cylinder engines now deactivate 2 cylinders during light load. The technology that Cadillac pioneered in the worst possible way is now standard practice across the global auto industry. The V8-6-4 wasn't wrong. It was just born about 25 years too early into a world where the silicon hadn't caught up with the ambition. There's something almost poetic about it. Cadillac built the first mass-produced V8 engine back in 1914. 67 years later, in 1981, they built the first mass-produced engine smart enough to decide how many of those cylinders it actually needed. The engine that knew too much and could process too little. The right idea at the wrong time, in the wrong car, for the wrong customers, controlled by the wrong computer. The 368 block itself was fine. The solenoids worked. The concept was sound. The only thing that failed was the tiny electronic brain trying to orchestrate all of it in real time. A quarter century later, when processors caught up, the same basic idea became standard equipment on millions of vehicles. Cadillac's great sin wasn't dreaming too big, it was rushing the dream into production before it was ready, betting the entire brand on technology they couldn't yet deliver, and handing the bill to customers who expected perfection. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in engineering. The visionaries see the destination clearly, they just underestimate the distance. And the customers who buy the first version always pay the highest price, not in dollars, in trust. Cadillac lost something in 1981 that it still hasn't fully recovered, its reputation as the standard of the world. And there you have it, the Cadillac V8-6-4, the engine that tried to save fuel and nearly burned down the brand. A technological marvel stranded in the wrong decade. If you've ever driven one of these, or better yet, if you've still got one running, with the system actually connected and working the way GM intended, you're part of a very small club, and I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week. More engines, more disasters, more stories about engineers who reached for the future and got their fingers burned.